Well, good afternoon, good evening, or whatever time it is where you are. Welcome to our well-spaced in-person audience, and to those of you joining us online who are, I imagine, even better spaced with respect to each other. My name is Mark Vesey. I'm principal of Green College, here on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I think I can stay in the camera shot and safely take off my mask. We have the opportunity this afternoon to grapple with the besetting problem of our time and to have, as our panelists, two exceptionally well-informed speakers to that subject. The issue, as you know, is getting China right, specifically the challenge for our research universities. And to speak to that topic, we have Paul Evans, who is the HSBC Chair in Asian Research at the University of British Columbia. Some of you may have seen a recent op-ed piece of his in the Globe and Mail on precisely this subject. And joining him this afternoon is John Krige, who is the Kranzberg Professor Emeritus of, well, it's Science and Technology Studies, in effect, at Georgia Institute of Technology. And I'm going to mention here, not sparing John's blushes under his mask, that John is a recent recipient of the Francis Bacon Award in the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, in effect for his career achievements in that field. And we congratulate him for that award. John is also a distinguished visiting fellow of Green College. And I think the plan is now that he will lead off, turn things over to Paul, and then we'll see how it goes. There will in any case be plenty of time for questions, both from in-person participants, and if you're following on the live stream, put your question in the chat, and we will convey it to the panel. And we'll also pass this microphone around so that anyone else who joins the conversation in this room will be heard across the country and beyond. So John, thank you very much. Let's take this away.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome everyone out there. I'm so glad that you're able to join us for this event. Listening to Paul Evans speak about the Canadian situation has been one of my real privileges over the last 15 months. We've been communicating virtually, me in Paris, where I'm retired, Paul here in Vancouver, about the position that Canada is taking in terms of dealing with with China in research collaboration. I've been studying this from the United States point of view for about 5 years, and I'm going to very briefly give a backdrop to the situation in the United States and then hand it over to Paul to talk about Canada. Beginning in 2017, the Trump administration launched a sustained assault on the scientific and technological collaboration between the American research system and their partners in China. Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, told Senator Marco Rubio that in almost every field office of the agency around the country, the FBI had noticed that what he called non-traditional collectors of intelligence, notably professors, visitors, and students in science and engineering, were exploiting the openness of the American research system to, quote, help China climb the economic ladder at our expense. There was, said Wray, a whole-of-society threat to the American research system that required a whole-of-society response from the United States. Laboratories at the cutting edge of research in engineering technologies were the prime sites of an organized program of economic espionage and the theft of intellectual property by foreign nationals from China, he said, who walked out of the door with American IP that they then commercialized back home, according to Wray. The Chinese government's Thousand Talents program was accused of being one of the key instruments of economic espionage. The TTP offered generous financial and research incentives to top scholars at American universities to spend some time on a Chinese campus every year for up to 5 years. Their task was to establish a local research capacity by training students and faculty in advanced fields of science and engineering, identified in major planning documents like Made in China 2025. Charles Lieber, one of Harvard University's most prestigious faculty, is an example of the case. We're very well known. Lieber was offered over $1 million and material support to build a mirror lab in Boston, of his lab in Boston at the Wuhan University of Technology, there to develop efficient electric batteries using nanotechnology. Some would see no harm in this. David Zweig at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology has remarked that for decades the US has used similar strategies to attract their brightest and best from other countries to settle in the country, in the US, and to contribute their skills to the American research and development system. China's Thousand Talents program, he says, simply seeks to reverse the brain drain by encouraging US-based researchers, many of them ethnic Chinese who had moved to the US originally, to plough back their knowledge and experience into the burgeoning Chinese research system, generously funded by China's massive trade deficit in its favor. This comparison for the Trump administration is completely gratuitous. In their view, foreign researchers who come to the United States contribute basic scientific knowledge to the well-being of all mankind. The Thousand Talents program is an instrument used by China, by the Chinese Communist Party, for nationalistic ends. It is a tool of economic espionage exploited to steal IP that is extracted from naive American-based researchers by their Chinese partners. All of the major federal agencies, spearheaded by the National Institutes of Health, have taken steps to mitigate the risk of IP loss by researchers funded by US taxpayers' dollars who have collaborative projects in China, including threatening to deny them any further government support for their research. The State Department has used visa policies to make it increasingly difficult for Chinese students to study on American campuses. It has also restricted graduate work in 3 fields, aeronautics, robotics, and high-tech manufacturing, to just 1 year renewable with a visa instead of the more usual 5 years. Universities have also stepped up to the plate. MIT has established an internal mechanism to vet any collaborative effort by its research faculty for potential transfers of IP abroad. They've also followed the Trump administration's exclusion of telecommunication giant Huawei from the US market by refusing in principle to accept any research funds offered by Huawei. It is extremely difficult to bring criminal charges for stealing IP against foreign researchers working in the freewheeling and open environment of a US research laboratory. By proxy, as it were, the FBI and the Department of Justice have brought charges of failing to disclose foreign sources of funding on grant applications and failing to declare foreign income to the IRS in order to punish US-based researchers for collaborating with China. And about 24 of them have indeed been caught in that web. Many more are apparently in the pipeline. The numbers are small, but the threat of sanctions for those who continue to take money from the Thousand Talents program weighs heavily on researchers now in the United States who want to collaborate with China. Has the Biden administration changed tack? Not so far as we know. If anything, it has reinforced politics put in place by its predecessor in line with his pivot to Asia. In fact, as soon as he was inaugurated, President Biden reinstated Trump's appointee, Christopher Wray, as his own director of the FBI. Biden is also encouraging his allies to treat China as a systemic rival, with effects on the research ecosystem in Europe and also in Canada. And that is what Paul Evans will speak about. Over to you, Paul.
Let's see if we're on. Good evening on a wet, cold Vancouver night, as it seems like December is arriving early today. And thank you for coming this evening and being online for a presentation about Canada and China. Universities have been a key player in Canada-China relations for more than 40 years. Initially as a kind of aid project to assist China in its own development, but over time moving into students and student exchanges, particularly Chinese students coming this direction. But in the last decade into another realm altogether, which is about collaborative and cooperative research activities. Not based on aid, but based on academic merit and the desire for the advancement of science, social sciences, and the humanities. That 40 years of interactions between our universities, our professors, and their Chinese counterparts is facing new headwinds in fact, a significant set of headwinds, and now operating in a new atmosphere that where for 40 years these exchanges and activities were seen as valuable, where they were seen as popular, and where they were seen as part of the mission of our universities, which is to encourage exchange, openness, visitors, and the flow of ideas. The new atmosphere is the result, and partly, of the geopolitics that John mentioned. It's also the result of a new calculation of what Western countries' interactions with China might be. This is a new era of geopolitical competition and rivalry, what the Biden administration calls strategic competition with China, extreme strategic competition. And in that context, universities, research are part of a much bigger configuration of ways to challenge and push back against China. The phrase that I use to try to capture what is going on in U.S.-China relations, as it's going to relate to universities, our topic today, is techno-nationalism. And this is the idea that what we produce, goods, services, have to be looked at through the perspective of national security. Things that used to be normal economic transactions, normal technology transactions, and normal academic and idea transactions are now being looked at through a new lens. And that new lens is national security. National security no longer just means the military and the intelligence and security world. We've been dealing with that aspect of interactions with other countries back to the Cold War with the Soviet Union. This is something different and much bigger. The approach of techno-nationalism is that the challenge is not just to deal with military sensitive or dual-use technologies, but also to see new technologies in areas that are seen as essential to economic competitiveness. And that suddenly stretches what was a pretty small set of topic areas into one that is much larger. In the United States, that definition of areas that are seen as sensitive from a national security perspective include artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biopharmacy, a range of different areas that are there not just because they give other countries of concern, and this is principally about China. Not that it just is a concern, but that the list has got pretty wide of what those concerns are. And further, behind this new headwind of concern is the matter of ethics and values. Recently, American intelligence agencies and the funding agencies have started to take a new look at research that could be related to human rights violations, anti-democratic activities, surveillance, that again is not traditional military security, it's not even economic advantage, but it means in a variety of circumstances that the United States is going to restrict and surveil activities by American actors, whether they be corporations or universities, in areas that might affect, for example, human rights in Xinjiang, that might relate to the national security law in Hong Kong. So this techno-nationalism has expanded. And it is important to understand that while universities are a part of this, we're not the main game. The main game in this is American corporations and American entities that are that have connections with China. They're not cutting them all off, but they are increasingly emphasizing decoupling, nearshoring of supply chains, encouraging American companies to change the pattern of their investments in China. Some of them still are putting money in, but not for those global supply chains. So this is part of a strategic competition with a country that is being played out with several different dimensions. The China threat, as seen through that lens, is multidimensional. The China threat is espionage, something we've understood for a while. It's about intellectual property theft. It's about cyber attacks on American institutions. It's about students as spies, as John mentioned one framing of the matter. When you put this all together, it is a new era in the American approach. Well, we're not here to talk about the United States today, except to recognize that what is going on there has had parallel effects in several countries. And one of them is Canada. And in one of those areas that is our focus today, it's universities. Suddenly, a China that used to be subject to engagement strategies, what can we do to expand our connections, suddenly is being looked at in a different light. And that light is, how can we monitor and restrict them from violating national security defined in this much broader way. So what has been happening in Canada? And my suggestion is that the challenges our universities face partly relate to research, and I'll be focusing on those heavily today, but that they also relate to a number of other areas. They're going to relate to the kinds of partnerships we want to have with Chinese institutions. They're going to relate to the kind of individuals we can recruit either as students or as partners or as visitors to our institutions. And that also matters of our student atmosphere. What is going on in our academic atmosphere when students are often quarreling with each other, pushing back with each other around, for example, the issue of Hong Kong and the demonstrations there. So the challenge for our universities is part of a much bigger challenge about moving whether and how far from strategic engagement to strategic competition and restriction. And the winds blowing from the United States are pretty clear. Well, what's going on in Canada? There's a number of things happening. One of them, and it's important, Canada has not yet decided, our federal government, our Prime Minister, exactly how we are framing China now. Is it a strategic competitor? Well, yes, in some areas. Is it a cooperator, a country we need to work with for both our interests, the Chinese interests, and global interests? Yeah. Is it a competitor? Are there some areas where we have to be very careful about how we compete with China and some of those national security concerns that have been most clearly defined in the United States? But there's also a fourth category, which China is challenge, China as adversary. So at this stage and through our last election, there was no formal Canadian statement on how we frame China. Are we going to use the American language and approach? But what is clear is that the American approach, the gravitational pull of the United States is bringing us into activities, some of which are already beginning. And before that formal statement on what Canada and China should be doing together, or not, has been formulated. And let me give just a couple of examples of things that have happened vis-a-vis universities. Let me start with universities, and let me start first with research. Give you some examples. The provincial government, the cabinet in Alberta, recently demanded that all of the universities in Alberta re-examine, review their China partnerships, all of the partnership agreements that were there and any new ones that were being considered, and that they all be put on pause until an assessment could be done of their real value and of their dangers. This was quite remarkable. No other provincial government has done it, but it's a kind of straw in the wind, if you will, of what some provincial governments are thinking about. And remember, in Canada, education is a provincial responsibility. So we're watching quite carefully what different provinces, including our own, are thinking about on how to gauge what is appropriate, what is politically acceptable, and what will our public accept in moving forward with China. Because as we know, opinions about China have soured dramatically in this country, partly as a result of the two Michaels and the anger, the sense of betrayal that came accompanying that crisis. But I think it's deeper. I think that the Canadian public, rightly, or I think often wrongly, have come to a judgment of China that is increasingly similar to that American judgment of China as a competitor, as an adversary, and as a country whose values are fundamentally different than those of Western countries. So the province of Alberta is out in front on this issue, but Ottawa is acting as well at the federal government level. Some of that has come from CSIS, the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, that has been unprecedentedly active in warning Canadian institutions about the risks that occur in dealing with China and Chinese partners. And those have been largely about espionage, cyber attacks, and intellectual property theft. And CSIS has made visits to a number of campuses in the country, in fact, dozens, for the first time to begin talking about what some of those risks are. They are other government agencies, particularly innovation, science, and economic development, has been playing a role in essentially trying to quarterback, if you'll excuse an American football metaphor. What ISET has been doing is trying to bring together our intelligence agencies, some of our other government departments, including defense and global affairs, plus our universities, to find ways forward with guidelines on how far we should move in restrictions on research, new surveillance, how far and in what sectors. So in our country, unlike the United States, we have a government department that is not just from the enforcement, the FBI, the Department of Justice, Department of Education, but also from, in the Canadian case, one that is interested in economic development. And there, China looks a little bit different. There are risks in working with China, but ISED is also aware of the value and the necessity of cooperating with China in a variety of fronts for the economic well-being of Canadians. So, but we do have, I said, we have a process that has involved representatives of the U15, the university, kind of big research universities in Canada, and Universities Canada, to talk about guidelines. What should we be doing in Canada moving forward to identify risks, make universities aware of where there are real risks in working with China, but at the same time to keep in mind what are the advantages, what are the plus sides of the equation. And I have the highest respect for what ISED has been trying to do in bringing together two worlds that don't fit easily, and that are also keeping a very close eye on what is happening in the United States, in Australia, in the United Kingdom, and other countries that are wrestling with some of these same matters. The Americans are way out in front in a particular approach, and I don't think it's going to be the approach that is completely adopted here in Canada, but it is sampling of the same soup. Our intelligence agencies, our officials are concerned about intellectual property theft. They are concerned, and there have been examples, as you have seen, of espionage in our research laboratories. I don't know that we have any good cases from universities. But there are real problems that need to be addressed. But that the agencies, if you look at China exclusively through the lens of threats, there's a lot of things to look at. But if you look at it from the lens of how do we understand those risks, how do we measure them, how do we make our campuses more aware of what they are, that part. And then a third part, which is what are the areas that we must continue to move ahead with in our research and our collaborations. And that leads us to the first major effort by the federal government to set up regulations that were designed to actually put teeth into some of the concerns. And that was NSERC, the National, what does NSERC stand for? National Science Engineering. NSERC has a new program and they put in new rules. And it was essentially to be eligible to apply, a researcher had to do a risk assessment. Now, risk assessment is, it was not defined very carefully what a risk is. But this is the idea that before you go in and work with a country of concern on a topic with a partner or as an individual or an institution, that when you go in to work with them, you have to assess what are the risks to Canada. And those risks can be intellectual property, they can be espionage, they also can be potentially, I don't think it's an NSERC problem, but potentially they could be matters of human values. Is a project essentially going to be deleterious to democratic norms and practices? No, it isn't exactly figured into the NSERC model, but it's a small program, one part of the NSERC funding package. It's not on all, at least as far as I know. It hasn't been rolled out to all of the NSERC funding, but it is being watched very carefully. And it's being watched carefully because for some, this is a pilot project to see how this effort at control is going to play through in operational concerns and operational settings with our universities. How are profs, how are universities going to respond? Is this going to do something that is in this pilot project? Is it going to do what it intends to do? Is it going to hit inadvertent consequences? Well, I hope it is a pilot. I hope that they are monitoring very carefully what the responses is from universities and our researchers. Because there's another view of this new program, is that it isn't just a pilot, it is a model that is going to be applied not only in other NSERC areas, but also in the other granting councils, whether those be in medicine, in the social sciences, etc. That in essence, government is saying to universities and researchers, you need to be aware of risks, you need to have risk identification and risk avoidance strategies in place before you can get federal government funding. And this is a model not dissimilar to what went on in the United States. They've been doing this now for, depending on how you count it, 4 years. And it continues under the Biden administration. But in this small micro domain of NSERC, it's coming into Canada. And I would suggest that rather than see this as just the example, it is an example of what we're going to be dealing with very quickly. Because not only will the number of agencies potentially be expanded that will make similar kinds of requests, but that the very areas that are going to be hinted at, though not formally stated, hinted at of concern are expanding dramatically. And so to get a hint at that, in July, earlier this year, the Investment Canada Act, which is about what kinds of firms can invest in Canada. The Investment Canada Act was altered such that there are now 13 new sensitive areas. Those 13 sensitive areas bear remarkable resemblance, not perfect, but remarkable resemblance to the same list that the United States uses. And this includes, just to give two big examples, anything quantum and quantum computing in particular, but also artificial intelligence. A pretty broad category, but it is one that is in the Investment Canada Act. Any Chinese or investment from a country of concern in these areas automatically goes through a review. Now, that wasn't applied to the university yet, but as universities and researchers, as they are having to respond to the kind of requests that were built into the NSERC guidelines, these are exactly the questions they have. So in implementation of this new strategy, it is, first, what exactly are the sensitive areas? Any of my science colleagues I speak to, when we talk about quantum physics or quantum computing, or we talk about artificial intelligence, it's dozens of independent areas. Some of them overlap, but that it is a huge field. And some things may have some kind of strategic or military application or concern. Some of them may have economic consequences. But in an era of the fourth industrial revolution, where data and a whole new form of industrial production is taking place, these categories are hugely wide. Well, which one do we really care about? And I think that's something that the government is wrestling with right now on how precisely to measure it. Who defines what a sensitive area is? Is it because it's on an American list? Is that enough? Well, Canadian officials don't like that. But they're going to have to come up with some definitions of exactly who defines that. If you're a university research professor and you're told to identify risks, your first question is, what kind of risks? What am I worried about? If you're a dean and you're having to approve something, you ask the same question. And if you then have to sign off on that before it even goes to the funding agency, basically these matters are being pushed down to the universities with very little guidance on exactly what is sensitive. What is a risk? How do you define it? What would be an appropriate strategy for responding to it? And who is an appropriate partner? One of the things that has bedeviled the Americans and the Australians who have gone down this path is if you're going to do a research project or you want to do some joint funding with a Chinese individual, what's appropriate? In some cases, in Australia, they have said that any partner that is associated with a Chinese military organization is out. You can't do it. Sometimes you can't do it with anyone who has been a part of the 1,000 Talent program, which John mentioned earlier, which is there are many talent programs, but they are very active. If you align with a professor who's on that list, in the United States, you're not going to get funding. Would you in Canada? Are we going to define so that our deans and others say that here's the list you can't work with? I mean, in Alberta, when they came up with their demand for partnership review, what the criteria was any institution that was connected to the Chinese Communist Party. Well, that's fascinating because I challenge anyone to think of an institution in China that isn't connected to the Chinese Communist Party. So that if you read it at its simplistic worst, it was cutting off all connections with just about any kind of Chinese partner we can think of. But we don't have those guidelines yet. We don't know how they're going to be defined, and that's a discussion that is underway. We also don't know who's going to enforce things. If, for example, a researcher doesn't submit the right information, doesn't, as in the United States where this has come up frequently, when the FBI and the Department of Justice start charging professors with criminal offenses for not disclosing fully who their partner was, not mentioning that Professor Krige was connected with a a Chinese equivalent of Professor Krige, was connected to the 1,000 Talents program, or that was connected to research for the Chinese military on advanced materials. That's not clear. What is an appropriate partner? And I think the other thing that is essential to monitor, if it is a pilot, is about inadvertent consequences. What is this going to mean if we pursue this in the way that seems to be hinted at in this program? And I would describe those two inadvertent consequences that are chill and heat. There's a chill factor. If for any researcher it's now going to demand extra information that needs to be provided and a risk that you're not going to be funded, are we going to get people shying away from China partnerships in general? That it's too much of a headache, it's too much of a risk. Just as American corporations now are using that calculation in whether they're going to do business in China. Not that they necessarily agree with the rules, but that there's a risk, you just might lose out on the deal. There's that kind of chill. There's a second chill, which is the chill as it affects professors of Chinese descent. One of the extraordinary things about most of our partnerships and collaborations, not all of them, but many of them, most of them, are with who set those up? People of Chinese descent, whether they're from the mainland, whether they're from Taiwan, whether they've been here for 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations. The people who are the connective tissue in this area are mainly people of Chinese descent. And as we have seen in the United States, those people have been targeted in some pretty extraordinary ways and has created a backlash. It has created a backlash here in Canada. One of the only groups that I've seen that has tried to intervene in the process, raise concerns about it, have been groups of Chinese professors who are worried that their livelihoods are in peril. But there's also a heat matter, and that's the following, that to be working in areas that are then identified as risky, you go ahead with them. The concern is that you are going to be seen as a potential agent of China, that you're going to be seen as not just a security risk, but lacking in loyalty. And this charge, the big heat, we haven't seen it in Canada yet, though we're getting close to it with the Winnipeg Virology Institute. But for others in the United States, whether you're at Harvard or MIT or University of Tennessee, there are many Chinese professors of Chinese descent who are worried about playing the risk game because they're going to be singled out and pointed to. Now, I'm not suggesting this was the intention, and I'm not suggesting that there's evidence that this has actually been applied yet in Canada, but there's no reason to think that it isn't coming. The forces in Ottawa wanting national security and these kind of risk mechanisms is growing. Well, I won't do it tonight, but there are other challenges for our universities, not just our researchers, not just our scientists, not just our medicine guys, or maybe even some of our social scientists. We're facing other big challenges in the universities. One of them is partnerships. Who can we partner with in China going forward? Is it wide open? We have our discretion on this. Are there going to be rules and guidelines? And if so, what are they going to look like? One of the interesting questions that has already shown up here on our campus, here at UPC, is related to Hong Kong and a view that some professors have that our partnerships, a training program, a collaborative exchange program where you send students back and forth, some are arguing we shouldn't be doing any of that with China, that China is a adversary, that China is a bad regime, a neo-totalitarian regime, and China is off the scale. What has changed recently is debates about Hong Kong. Now that Hong Kong is more deeply integrated into the mainland, do we treat Hong Kong institutions, University of Hong Kong, where I taught, Do we treat them the same way we would Fudan University or the China Aeronautical University in Beijing? Because they're now part of the same system. Well, this is playing out at different institutions as they're deciding what they can do with partnerships. It's going to be a real issue for individual research collaborations and projects. Who do you partner with? As you're trying to put something together or as you're making your own calculation. There are new risks in doing work in China. We have a person here who has been doing field work. It's a lot more difficult to do work in China now than it was 15 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago. Things are tightening, the restrictions, the controls. Xi Jinping's government is more repressive domestically and more assertive internationally than his predecessors. We're into a new regime, not just because of the Americans, but because of the Chinese. And in that context, what are the calculations of an individual researcher? Well, some of it can be around funding, but there's ethical questions that our people are now asking about, should I do work that might have benefit to this government? Or even, to put it more precisely, what are the implications, societal implications, of the research that I do? And some have pretty strict standards in that, or at least they're suggesting that anything that strengthens the Chinese government, the Chinese regime, the party state, should be illegitimate. And in our campuses, our faculty members are debating these kind of members as we speak. Well, and I think the final area is going to be campus atmosphere. I teach a course here on global China and world order, and watching the tensions in my class between the students from mainland China and the students from Taiwan and Hong Kong is fascinating. This is a very sore spot. And the efforts by student groups to promote particular perspectives on the Hong Kong demonstrations, for example, is a clear example. If we were out there and we weren't all in masks and it wasn't raining on us, as it doesn't do in Australian campuses as often, there's a lot of tensions and headwinds that are emerging there, where some feel that this new era of assertive and repressive China intersecting with democratic institutions and Western norms, Western ideas of academic freedom. We're on the, I used to teach at York University, and about a third of our time for our Senate and our President was talking about tensions between Israeli students and Palestinian students. This raised all kinds of challenges at multiple levels. I'm concerned, or I think I would even predict, that we're going to see something similar. It's already happening, but in a bigger way on our campuses. So how we're going to get ready for this, it's a different and a little bit and a bigger question than what we're doing on the research front. Well, let me not just leave you with a description, but to come forward with 4 ideas. And the framing for it is the China challenge isn't going to go away. Now that we've solved the 2 Michaels, Canadians are more accepting. We might be a little less worried about Chinese aggressive actions internationally and at home. That the storm is over and we can go back to the old normal. I don't think so. I don't think we're going to be able to go backwards. That, in other words, this has been a big storm in our relations with China around the 3 M's. But that we're not just, the storm is over, but the season has changed. We're going to be going into a period, for a variety of reasons, of winter in our interactions with China. Now, I'm hopeful that it will be a Vancouver winter and not an Edmonton winter, and that we take some steps to try to keep as many things open as possible. But things are changing, the atmosphere. It's not a coincidence that all of this is coming and that it's just, excuse the metaphor, the tip of the iceberg. Well, I think that 3 ideas. First is, as these things are now developing in Canada fairly quickly, but still at a new stage, we need stronger university voices in the process. Now, university voices don't just mean our administrators, our senior administrators, our vice presidents who have been part of some of the committees that design those NSERC rules. But it's our professors across the campus, across the country, who on the campuses that I've visited, some of them understand the way the wind is blowing, the way the new season is coming in, but not many. Not many are yet even aware of the basics of the vigilance and awareness that are really necessary parts of a response to the new China. But that we are not having the voices of our scientists, of our China specialists, plugged into these technical questions that are being decided on. What is a sensitive area? What is the nature of a connection to a dangerous Chinese organization? Our faculty members haven't been involved in this discussion. At the only university that I can see where they've done a fair effort at trying to do some of that is the University of Toronto. But it hasn't happened at our institution. And how we're going to get those university voices forward, I think would be welcomed by some who feel that we have a real problem we have to deal with, but we can do it in a moderate and intelligent way that reduces the consequences. And I'd conclude by saying, I think as those of us who work extensively with China, that we are going to have to make a real effort, as our business colleagues are, on the matter of creating safe spaces, defining kinds of projects in agreement with the Chinese side that are seen as acceptable, a kind of pre-approval process on different areas with a safe space. And that safe space really refers to an area where we can deal with the differences that we have with China. Anyone who works in China knows their conception of academic freedom is different than ours. Excuse me. Anyone knows who works with China that they have rules, understandings, procedures that are antithetical. Everybody knows that Chinese institutions are more closely connected to, if not government, at least part, than our institutions. These are asymmetries that exist there. There used to be an asymmetry of funding, but now the Chinese have more money for these projects than we do. But there are those asymmetries, and how we can open up a discussion with our Chinese counterparts on the new era. I'm involved with a couple of projects, one that involves some profs at Harvard, and another that involves a few of us here in Canada, trying to talk honestly and openly with China about some of the changes we're going to have to make. There are certain procedures they're going to have to accept. And the metaphor is to keep the door open to China with exchanges, partnerships, a whole range of collaborations. Keep the door as far open as far as possible while closing some windows. There's going to be some areas we are going to have to fence off. No collaborative work here, no research, no visitors. This is dangerous. But unless we can do that, put those small fences there, I'm afraid the whole field is going to be restricted. So, and if I had a last idea, I hope that we can learn from the examples of what's going on in some other countries, both the negative side that John outlined with reference to the United States, but the positive side. And the country that I have found most interesting as a comparator to us, who is also worried about how to get the balance right in this matter, is the United Kingdom. They have come up with Cambridge University, and under our former president, Stephen Toope, have come up with a fascinating statement of principles. I was very sorry to hear just a few minutes ago that Stephen Toope is stepping down as the head of, as the equivalent of the president of the university, because his stand on China has been courageous, both on defending funding and projects with China, but on a principled basis. And I think we can learn from them. I also think we can learn from the United Kingdom. Once we have new agencies, new institutions that are going to be telling universities what to do, what is the guideline? What is acceptable? 1,000 Talents program. Once the rules start being made, who's making those rules? And the UK, instead of having their security and intelligence and enforcement officials make those decisions, is staffing from the bottom up. They're hiring and training a whole new generation of people who will be aware of the security environment, but not of the security community. And I think that's something that we can look forward to as an area that we can learn from our former colonial masters in dealing with China. So that's more than enough, John and Mark, I think, for today, but I'm very interested in your reactions if there are some questions that have come in. And we have some people here who have been on the front line of some of these issues. A dean of science who's with us, and a professor of materials engineering who has been very concerned about the matter of impact, the chill and the heat on professors of Chinese descent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for a very wide-ranging and extremely rich presentation of those issues. While other people ponder questions and comments, perhaps I could just ask if you would to help us maybe take a step back. You mentioned at one point that we have, in a sense, we've been somewhere like this before in a Cold War setting. It feels as though 30 years on from the end of that particular episteme and regime, we've realized that certain kinds of fairly relaxed, call it Western expansiveness, confidence in our soft power, that enabled us, as it were, safely to make these openings towards China, for example. That kind of expansiveness, which people who were at UBC 30 years ago remember as part of a kind of regime change here, as this university opened to the Canadian Pacific ecology. There's a certain loss of confidence which has coincided with, well, globalization, disruptive new technologies, and not incidentally the emergence of a whole range of new kinds of nationalism. Those were actually the three things that Stephen Toop was talking about when he was here a few weeks ago, describing what he calls our new age of anxiety, brought on by some combination of the effects of globalization, the emergence of new nationalisms, and the disruptive effects of technology. That seems to me to be quite an accurate modeling for the shift that you've described in our having, as it were, to give up on some of our confidence and ideals of, I don't know, the mid-1990s. We don't feel as bullish any longer about our power in the world, and hence our ability to take the sorts of calculated risks that would in any case be needed to see constructive collaboration with countries like China that can so easily be construed as adversaries too cruel. I say this on the day when Stephen Toop, as Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge, has had to backpedal on arrangements that Cambridge was about to make with the United Arab Emirates for some kind of investment on their part in research at Cambridge because of the revelations on the Pegasus papers. So, I mean, there was a whole constellation of these new calculations. Could you speak perhaps a little to that, just before we then narrow down again into more local concerns?
Mark, I would never want to disagree with Stephen Toop, but I think he's missed one other ingredient of the great change. Why techno-nationalism? Why are American officials and a lot of smart people so concerned about China as a potential threat in all the areas we talked about? And I think that it's because of a change in the balance of power. That in essence, the United States is losing its dominant position in the world and is particularly concerned. We won the Cold War against the Soviet Union, at least the thinking goes. We're not winning the new competition with the new China. Now, whether that's a realistic assessment doesn't matter. It is now that concept of fear built into American reactions. It's a threat. It's a threat-based, fear-based regime. And I used to run into, 5 years ago, I work on kind of international strategic studies. And I would talk with my American friends, this is before Trump, about what they think about China's rise. You know, and well, some good things, some bad things. But I was told repeatedly that China could only rise so far. And it could only rise so far in these areas of the new economy because it didn't have the research capabilities, but fundamentally because it was run by the Chinese Communist Party. And that the Chinese Communist Party could not foster the kind of innovation that was necessarily to be the preeminent innovator in the globe. Come 3 years after that, somewhere in the mid-2015s, that view changed, and in fact it flipped on its head. And there was a sudden fear of China as a powerful innovator. Not in all fields, in fact, not even in most fields, but that in some of the fields of the fourth industrial revolution, with data, with quantum, with artificial intelligence, that China not only could innovate, it was innovating in the top drawer. And I think the way to understand that fear is understanding the American saga in its interactions with Huawei as a company. Huawei is complex, but Huawei as the leader in 5G, not just as these guys who manufacture some equipment, but the science behind it, the research and development, the technology. China is a world leader. Now, it isn't in a lot of fields. So, Mark, I think your fundamental point is right. This is not like the Cold War with the Soviet Union, partly because this is one that many Americans fear they can't win. And further, that they are so intermeshed when we find the operation of big science in the United States, so interconnected with Chinese partners in research, in development, much less what goes on in the private sector, that it is a different world and it's a fear-based approach. How we get over that, that's the question.
John, you guys had a plan probably for how you were going to conduct this phase, so why don't I turn it back to you and then we can bring in other members of the audience.
Thank you. We have the Dean of Sciences with us, and I wonder, Megan, if you'd like to make any comment. Oh, sorry. Good evening. We have the Dean of Sciences with us this evening, and I wonder, Megan, if you'd like to react to what Paul has said in any way, or you prefer not to.
Well, difficult for me to say. I'm very pleased to have enjoyed talking with John and Paul over the last 24 hours. I suppose it's been a real highlight. I really can't approach sort of the quality of the statements that Paul would have other than to perhaps talk a little bit about what I could imagine are the benefits and the risks of what we're facing going forward, and so. Must I? Okay.
You're no longer the voice of God, you're the embodiment of a person.
I prefer the voice of God. Yeah, so I think that now I think I'm speaking mostly from my own experience as a researcher, which would be that I don't know. We've had a long history, in my field. I work in physics. I'm a quantum physicist, and so The way that we do science has really changed fundamentally in the last 20 years, and this is true internationally. You can see in terms of what sorts of things individuals want to do. They want to work more in teams, in collaborations, and in addition, we have a greater and greater reliance on research tools that are of a scale that are too much for individuals to own, even for individual countries. And so collaboration has been baked in the last generation, I would say. And the benefit of it is considerable because although there are many scientists who work as individuals, there are many of us who like these collaborations because a perfect collaboration is one where everybody brings something that is complementary, so everybody is critical to the collaboration. And the advantage to you intellectually is you don't have to have every thought, right? And indeed, by working with other people closely in the collaboration, there is new thoughts, come forward, and you make much more progress than you would as an individual in these sorts of cases. And this approach is really good, I would think, for anything that's associated with technology, anything that has an experimental aspect, perhaps one where theory would also be helpful. And so, from my perspective, there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot to gain, from being able to select your partners from anywhere that you like around the world, based on your ability to make a compelling case there. That's a huge advantage to you as a researcher, as an intellectual person, so the risk, of course. And so going along with that then is also the question of ownership. Is like who owns the intellectual property, and I'm talking not in like the sense that the business sense, but rather for me that I don't work on anything that's at all applied. This is deep background information. In 50 years we will know whether it made any difference at all. But I don't feel that I own what it is my collaboration has developed, right? I've been part of developing that. We report in the open literature, and I think that my concern would be that we would be looking at a future where this kind of thing is just so cumbersome or so difficult to arrange that it just won't happen anymore. And so I think is the major thing that you lose. There seems to be also an undercurrent in a lot of this discussion, which is that it's actually that the Chinese are going to benefit from this. And I think maybe if there's really sort of mano-a-mano, technology-based, competition, that might be the case. But in most of the things that we're doing, at least on this campus, they would be collaborations such as the one that I discussed. It could be student exchanges or efforts to build relationships, institution to institution. And these things have gigantic benefit. And so this is really what's at stake, because it's very easy for the government or for the universities to take a very conservative approach, which is there's a risk here to our organization. And they don't really see the benefit because the benefit is long-term for much of what we're going to do in terms of keeping the cultural doors open, making sure that there's exchange of people so Chinese people know how it is to be in the United States and or in Canada, and Canadians know what it's like to work substantively in China. And I think that's really what's at stake. It's huge. And so some acceptance of risk, I think, is appropriate because much of what we do is benign in that sense. And so it's going to be a very tricky thing for us to try to, not have to drill into every single person's research, in huge detail to try to figure out if it's safe or not by everybody's standard. Or alternatively, on the other hand, it's just like, well, we can't do that, so basically everything is too risky for us. And so I think that universities, I think that the governmental agencies, will devolve to the second, which is, we have to paint this with a very broad brush. And so the one thing that I wanted to follow up with Paul about in his comments at the end is that you thought that there was a way that you could have pre-approval. That is, were you thinking of that as being institution to institution, or like UBC talks to I don't know, it's a university in China and sets up a set of collaborations that might evolve over time that we consider to be safe and they don't need to be reviewed? Or do you think it's government to government? What would work the best?
The answers are not clear, but the idea of pre-approval, as it were, could be around institutions that buy into certain elements of transparency about their projects, both on the Canadian side and on the Chinese side. That is not something we negotiate now in general. But is it possible in future? We're going to have to test that. Pre-approval could be subject areas as well. And that's where the kind of expertise that exists with our professors is going to be so important, is to say, yeah, you've given your criteria of what is dangerous. What part of artificial intelligence falls within that? What doesn't? There'll be some areas that are red zones. There'll be some areas that are green, no problem. But it's the yellow ones that are going to need to be investigated by teams of scientists and others to say, here's where there may be a risk of this sort. Does it pass the threshold?
Well, I can tell you that my colleagues feel really strongly that they feel that they have to collaborate and to be engaged with their colleagues in China, simply because you can't be a leader yourself, by cutting yourself off from what's going on. I mean, everything is so, everybody's working on the same exciting problems, right? And leadership involves, I guess, being in the best collaboration, having a transformative idea, these sorts of things. And, you can't really do that in isolation. So that's, that's, I think, one of the base rules that we'll have to, think about. I think that, the university is just in very early steps of trying to understand what these sorts of, these sort of guidelines would potentially be, and so I have to really agree with Paul that this is the time where faculty voices, ought to be weighing these considerations, and it's super easy, as well to say, maybe you don't want your students going to China because you don't agree with the regime, but there's the other half of that, which is, is it to the benefit of the student not to have a broad experience? And to understand what the world is like. So I think, you can cut it, many different ways, but I think I'll stop now.
Yes, who was? Don has
Thanks. Thanks, Paul and John, for the presentation. Paul, I'm particularly interested, it's a mundane question in some sense, but about data collection, both nationally and more specifically with regard to research projects. Is anyone or any institution collecting data on the whole range of collaborations, partnerships, exchanges, all of the stuff that we talk about? So there's that general question. And of course some of that would be provincial, but it would be useful to know whether or not the federal government is indeed embarking on a more national campaign. But the more interesting question for me is, given where your argument is going, at least where you're projecting what may happen in the future, is the extent to which any government agency is collecting data on the research partnerships and collaborations, and particularly those situations where money is coming in from both sides, from both China and Canada, and if so, what is being done with the information?
The easy and the disappointing answer is almost none of that is occurring in either by our institutions or by our government agencies. But I'll bet you that within 3 years we are going to be collecting that kind of collecting those data. The first example is we don't know all of our range of partnerships at the University of British Columbia. We did an Asia census 8 years ago when I was running the institute here, and we found that more than UBC professors told us in this census that they had partnerships with more than 100 different Chinese institutions. They told us that. It was the first time that had ever been recorded. Some formal partnerships are recorded, but what professors do hadn't been. And I'll bet that within 3 years, those individual professors are going to have to make available to their own institutions what they're doing. On your bigger question about whether governments are monitoring this, they're curious. In the university in Alberta, when the provincial government in Alberta has said to the universities, you tell us what your partnerships are. We want to see them now in advance. And to my knowledge, that's the first province in the country that has done that. And would they like that information? Not only would they like it, it is going to be essential as we go forward in defending partnerships to be able to say what they are. The idea that we just continue ahead, we're cooperating with whoever we wish on whatever terms a prof wants to do. Some see that as academic freedom. My sense is that in this era of semi-Cold War, an emerging Cold War, that's no longer a legitimate answer. You're going to have to do that up against some criteria. Now, we want the right criteria, but that it is going to be essential to provide that kind of information. So, to give one example of this in the United States is what Harvard University is having to do for its federal government agencies, is giving them a complete list of not only the projects, the partnerships, the formal ones, but the informal arrangements between all of their faculty members and people in countries of concern, principally China. That's coming in the United States. I don't know how many have complied, what the enforcement mechanism is. But if we buy this argument that essentially we're in an era of real geostrategic competition, that this is like a Cold War confrontation, then suddenly activities that we used to think were normal parts of our academic enterprise are now securitized. They are no longer independent. Dean Aronson, I hope that your vision of science can withstand the winds of geopolitics. Because the business people who I talk to, who used to say, global supply chains, invest where you make the best return on a dollar. Those companies, whether they're the biggest American companies or others, are now being caught up in a system where they are having to defend and in fact retreat from activities because of national security concerns. And I hope I'm wrong. I'm hoping that there's going to be a new détente between China and the United States. That's where the gravitational pull is in this. I'm hoping for that new détente that will allow science to continue in ways we've known it. But right now it's pretty difficult to bet your house that that's going to happen. In fact, to the contrary.
That's almost a summing up, but we do have a little more time if there are other questions or comments.
Would you be willing to speak, please, Professor Wang?
Is that okay? Okay. I'll sit here, so just make sure we have distance.
Well, you can turn around and speak to the big audience.
Yeah, yes. My name is Rich Wang, material engineering professor for 20 years UBC. I came to Canada by Canadian Thousand Talent Program, the CSIS. So hopefully Canada has benefited from that by opening door to China. I'm not expert on China Canada relation, but I lived half of my time in China, half of my time in Canada, so I just have observations. About the relation, I think if Canada wants to go to Cold War, most probably follow US. If Canada wants to move out of Cold War, maybe Singapore is another country to look at to find a balance, and that's all I could say. My comment is about this, because of this vision about China and the new policy, NSERC policy, national security, the NSERC national security guideline for research partnership, that this is a major program for many of us, major program other than discovery, that ask each professor at the submission stage to self-assess the risk for national security, going through a long list. And I am working on hip fracture prevention and artificial hips. But when I went through that one, I couldn't answer yes or no. I could answer unsure to every question. And my students, my lab, and my partners, even myself, am I a risk to national security? I'm not sure. So with that proposal will go to the final stage, that National Security Agency for review, yes or no, without feedbacks most probably, and accept or decline. So this is a concern. I'm not working on this proposal, but this is a concern to many of us, we call Chinese Canadian professors. I don't know, this is a very short, it's launching in July, still just a few months. We don't know the long term, we don't know whether it be measurable progress on whether this has already increased national security, help Canada, but what I've seen is the starting of downside development, the negative side, and we have a few colleagues who have withdrawn the proposal because of that process, or decide to delay the submission for that process. So this is a short-term evidence, at least what I've seen now. Intermediate evidence of concern for us, for the group of Chinese Canadian professors, we are worrying this is actually a starting point of the Canadian version of China initiative. And that is real in the United States. I have colleagues, I know my people, friends, being investigated in the United States. Am I the next one? Is my job at risk, not just my career? So this is a concern. I think we need to really worry about this. Back to Paul, your argument about university researchers, universities like progress on this research on this China and Canada, how this will affect influence policy. I thought this is a very good comment. Actually, this is my question. In terms of China, I think university researchers know better, do research, know better about China. But people in Ottawa, let's say politicians, are making decisions, policies about China. And when we do research, I actually submit my CIHR report on how my research in hip fracture has benefited policies, government policies. So the same question, how do our research in universities about China affect or help to change the policies in Ottawa? I know the policy will influence how we do research related to China, but our research on China will also affect policies set by Ottawa. So my question, Paul, to you, where's the balance? And we have seen the huge influence of government in terms of forcing policy to universities about doing research, limiting research on China. Or on the other side, we can also push up to see the balance. Where's the balance? And actually, John, do you see any difference in terms of this government policy and university research, this balance between US, Canada, and even China? So there's always a balance between these two groups. That's my question.
Do we have time for another hour and a half? Krige, thank you for the question, and thank you for your leadership and your courage in expressing concerns that maybe are going to reach some ears in Ottawa. My general take is that at this moment, before Canada decides that it's going to join the new strategic competition, American style, or defines another position, that there's a lot of moving pieces. I wouldn't want to have to go to the Parliament of Canada and make a case for why academic collaborations with China are in our national interest. I think you can make a strong case, but I think you might be, after what you saw in the Conservatives' election platform about what to do with China, you're not going to get very far. But at this stage, there are some very skilled bureaucrats, and I would applaud ISED in particular, who is basically encouraging us to develop mechanisms to pressure them. It's fascinating. They would like to see Canadian professors come forward with views, not just through our formal associations. You know, we have university presidents and others. That's great. But they are not yet feeling what our professors like you and Professor Aronson and others are actually feeling. So this is a time that we have a chance to, if we push it, I think we're going to need encouragement from our home institutions to do that, because it takes some courage and it takes a lot of time to want to try to influence it. But for at least a little bit longer, there's a window for us to get our views across on this matter, and maybe that's something that a Green College seminar like this one can do, is help stimulate some of that activity so that we can, instead of simply reacting to what comes from the top, to try to influence it, when we have some people, unlike the United States, where it all came from the top. University presidents didn't have a voice. But here in Canada now, if we push hard, and these are the critical months before NSERC becomes CIHR, before it comes SSHRC, etc., please treat NSERC as a pilot and listen to the profs.
You asked me for my view, and I really don't quite know what to say about Canada. But yes, hearing Dean Aronson speak, I'm deeply concerned about the threat to academic freedom, which is playing out here. And I want to stress academic freedom is not just an abstraction. As Dean Aronson stressed, it's a fundamental way in which science progresses, and in which science progresses on this campus. The freedom to choose whom you work with, because they're the best people in the world. And it's always been argued that only by working with the best people in the world can we do good work, and can we push the research frontier to our advantage. It's in our advantage to work with the best people in the world. And as a matter of fact, we know now, after the massive investment in R&D by the Chinese authorities and the huge production of PhDs in China, some of the best people in the world in many of these fields are in China. And I just don't want that point to be lost in the debate in Ottawa or anywhere else. I think it's lost in the United States, and I believe. And I think it has to be stressed again and again, that it's really to the advantage of working with the best people in the world, and we should do that if it's in China. And the only thing I would ask is, to Paul really, is, it's important, yes, that the faculty, and like yourself and Dean Aronson, take a stand on this, but are there formal channels available for them to have their voices heard? Are there formal committee structures in which people like this and like that in the room here can actually participate in the decision-making process, be heard and have an impact? Because if not, I'm afraid academic freedom is going to get lost.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Paul.
I'll take that as a question that we need to explore in more depth, of what mechanisms we need through our institutions and with leadership from our institutions that will bring the faculty members into the process. That is not happening yet.
But it's not through any lack of convening power on your part. And I would like to thank you particularly, not just for your own presentations, John and Paul, but for your success in bringing other people to this small table that we have here, where nonetheless, after an hour and a half, I can say that on a dark October evening in Vancouver, some considerable light has been shed on a really important expanse of concern for all of us. To everyone in the room, to those of you out there, I hope this carried to wherever you are. We're going to switch off the live stream now and carry on the conversation at Green College in a slightly different venue over dinner and afterwards. Thank you all once again. Special thanks to John and Paul for leading the way on this. Everybody, have a good evening. Go carefully in the dark. Stay safe and well.